Welcome to episode 6 of Criminal Mischief. I'm DP Lyle. Today we're going to talk about a question that a lot of writers get asked, particularly crime writers, and I've been asked it many times on panels and emails from authors and whatnot. And is it harder to write crime fiction today with all the modern stuff that's going on, with all the tools and techniques and everything we have? First of all, is it harder to get away with a crime now than it was, say, 60 years ago? Sure, it is harder. You leave behind more evidence. You know, the Lacard exchange principle says that anytime someone interacts with another person, place, or object, they leave part of themselves behind. And the whole world of forensic science is to find that evidence, analyze that evidence, and connect that evidence to someone. And so as it has progressed, forensic science has gotten much, much better at that. 100 years ago, 150 years ago, you didn't have to worry about DNA or even blood typing or hair and fiber analysis or fingerprints or firearms examination. You don't have to worry about all that stuff back in 1850. It didn't exist. So of course, things have changed, and they've changed in many, many ways. Yes, this makes writing crime fiction harder because you have more balls to keep in the air. You have more things that you have to consider when you're plotting your crime story. Now, back in the day, particularly the heyday of noir fiction, you know, the Hammett and Chandler in those days, it dealt more with the gumshoe asking the right questions, interfacing with the right people, using the right leverage, and solving the crime with good old shoe leather and great interrogation and things like this. It wasn't high-tech evidence. It wasn't the crime lab that solved the case. It was the PI. And it was Sam Spade. You know, it was that. And those are great stories for that reason. So if you are going to avoid all of this science that's come along, particularly in the last 30 or 40 years, set your story back then, set your story in the past, and then you can ignore all this stuff. But if you tell a modern crime story, there are so many things you have to consider along the way. I do this lecture I call Plotting the Perfect Murder. And what we do is we go through who we're going to kill, how we're going to do it, where we're going to do it, when we're going to do it, why we're going to do it, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then we deconstruct it, all the things that could go wrong, all the evidence that was left behind, all the everything. And some of it is back to the old gumshoe shoe leather work, and some of it is forensic science. And it's much, much harder to plot a murder or a crime of some kind now than it was 100 years ago. It's also harder to actually get away with one in real life. So there is that. There's no such thing as a perfect crime. So it has to do with the evolution of that. And I want to say right now on there'll be a link on the show notes on this show, but on my website, there's a forensic timeline, and you can see, it's under the articles link, you can see when and how all these things were developed. But let's start with something simple. Identification. How was someone identified in the past versus now? Well, back in the day, it was visual. Yeah, that's Joe. I know Joe. Well, if you set your story in a small town or in a closed community or a tight-knit community, then yeah, they can identify Joe. They know Joe. But if you're in a big city, particularly in a modern big city, that doesn't always work. Too many people look like each other, and memories aren't good, and eyewitnesses aren't good. We know all that now. We didn't know it then, but we know all that now. So just visual ID has changed dramatically. There have been many ways of trying to identify someone, not only from evidence at a crime scene, but witnesses. And one of the first things to identify people was Alphonse Bertillon. And again, this is all discussed in both Forensics for Dummies and How Done It Forensics. So if you really want to dig into this, but basically he devised a system where he took a bunch of measurements from different parts of the body, the length of certain fingers, the length of the ear, uh, the distance from here to there, that kind of thing. And he had this whole list of measurements, and each person had a different measurement profile, if you will. And so Bertillon was the ID expert until Fingerprints came along. And then it became a war between Fingerprints versus Bertillon. And this war went on and on and on. And a couple of very odd things happened around that time. Again, they're covered in the books I mentioned. But one was the famous West case. It turns out this guy named Will West was sent to prison, and they did the Bertillon thing, and da-da-da-da-da. They called it Bertillonage, the measurements. And he matched a guy who was already in prison there. The numbers were identical. Well, it turns out that guy's name was William West. So there's Will West and William West, and they both have identical, and they even looked alike. And it's like, whoa, wait a minute, what's going on here? Well, they then tested their fingerprints and found out their fingerprints were different. And that was basically the death knell for Bertillon's system, because if you couldn't distinguish brothers from each other, and yet you could do it with fingerprints, bang, immediately the whole world basically changed to fingerprints as identification. So you're going to use fingerprints in your story. How many times do you read a book or watch a TV program, and the guy goes in and robs a place, but he's not wearing gloves, he's not wiping off fingerprints, he's not being, you're saying, what is wrong with you? Have you not read Michael Connelly? Are you insane? Don't you watch, the true crime shows on TV? You can't leave your fingerprints everywhere. They're going to find you. And that's because no two people have had the same fingerprint ever. Now, I have a section in both of those books also on how fingerprints were developed. They had to prove that, number one, they didn't change over life. Number two, that no two people had the same thing. Number three, that there was an easy method of obtaining them, which there is. Now it's even done electronically. And the West case was big in that. So fingerprint identification now is a very useful tool. You didn't have to worry about it over 100 years ago. What's interesting is, though fingerprints were used back thousands of years for identification, they didn't really enter the criminal world until 1902, I think, down in Argentina, with a very famous case. Again, it's discussed, Juan Vucetich, but in his techniques, they actually solved a crime from a bloody fingerprint, and that's the first time it entered criminal justice. And since then, of course, now we have AFIS, the automated fingerprint identification system that the FBI runs, where everybody's fingerprints are uploaded into a big database. Now, I will say that not everybody subscribes to that, not every jurisdiction, so you might be able to use that in your story. So fingerprints have become standard. What's interesting is it didn't enter the criminal world until 1892, I think was the correct date. But prior to that, Mark Twain used fingerprints twice. Once was in Pudd'nhead Wilson, and once was a severed thumb in Life on the Mississippi, which was more of a nonfiction book about his life on the Mississippi. But he used fingerprints to identify someone long before it became a criminal justice tool. So, you can do the same thing. You can have your clever sleuth figure something out and kind of use it, even though it hasn't really entered the real world yet. Now let's talk about that for a minute. How do these things enter the real world? Well, first of all, there's basic science. You learn certain things, and then usually that basic science is applied to medicine. And then after it's applied to medicine, then it will enter the criminal justice system. A classic example is blood typing. The ABO system was discovered by Landsteiner in 1901, and this is what, you type A, type B, AB, or O, the ABO blood system, that's your blood type. He discovered these proteins that give blood type. Then it entered medicine because it was useful in determining blood transfusions. Blood transfusions were a crapshoot until they could actually identify the type of blood and give someone the right type. And of course, now it's even more sophisticated because we do cross matching, but at least it was a step forward. And only later did it begin to enter the criminal justice system. But the ABO system is not perfect. It can exclude, but it can identify. AB blood type is the least common, and it's around 3% of people have that. So if you find a blood smear at a crime scene, your sleuth does, and it's type AB, it excludes 97% of the people on the planet, but it still includes 3%, which is a very large number. But at least your sleuth, if you're going back in the pre-DNA days, and say 1930s and 40s and 50s, your story said, and now he can exclude certain suspects. But maybe there's a pool of suspects that still are there, either because they haven't been able to obtain their blood type or they're AB. And so you can use this in your stories to exclude certain people, but include others, or keep the suspense going. Well, of course, the next step in identification was DNA. And it's interesting that everybody, of course, has different DNA because we're all different. For many years, it was felt that identical twins had the exact same DNA. And that would make sense if you think about where identical twins come from. The sperm and the egg join together, they make the fertilized egg, and the first division from one cell into two, they separate. And then each of those cells goes on to develop a human. Well, they started with the same DNA, so they would have the same DNA. We call these identical twins. Now, fraternal twins are two eggs and two sperm. They are as different as if they were born 10 years apart. The only reason they're twins is they occupied the mother's womb at the same time, but they are as different as any other sibling. But identical twins come from the same source, and you would think they have the same DNA, and indeed, in most DNA profiling, they absolutely do. But as we go along, as we grow, as our billions and billions and billions of cells turn over, they die and others replace them, et cetera, and life goes on. That's happening all the time to all of us. Little mistakes creep in. Little changes in the DNA structure creep in because the replication of the DNA, which is the first step in cell division, you got to reproduce the DNA, and then the cell separates, and then they go on and they do that also, et cetera, et cetera. Little mistakes creep in. Things aren't perfect in this replication process. And with the newer DNA techniques, where you can actually look at every base in the strand, not just groups, not just types, not just certain locations. Now you start seeing even identical twins have different DNA profiles. So again, things have changed. So if you set, this is all new. So if you set your story 20 years ago, there was still DNA, but we didn't know this. And if you set it now, we now know this. Another interesting thing about DNA and fingerprints and all that is what's called touch DNA that has come along. Now, this is relatively new. So you could go back and have fingerprints found, but no one to look at, and you wouldn't have DNA. But now they can get DNA from fingerprints, because what does a fingerprint consist of? It's oils and dirt and grime and skin cells and things like that. In other words, trash that's on the end of your fingers, and some of it's your trash, your cells that you're sloughing off all the time. So when you leave a fingerprint somewhere, you're leaving behind a few cells. And it really only takes one cell, a single cell, to create a DNA profile, because that DNA is replicated through PCR, and then you do the STR analysis or the SNP, the SNP analysis, but you find out all this stuff's discussed in the books I talked about. And now you can develop a DNA profile from that. So, but the problem with all of these, DNA, blood type, fingerprints is you have to have something to compare it against. So we have the databases. I mentioned APHIS. There's also CODIS, which is the DNA database. And if the person's in there, if the person has had a felonious arrest at some time, or for whatever reason, I as a physician had to be fingerprinted, and my fingerprints are on file. I haven't been arrested for anything yet, but it's early in the day. But they're in there. So people's fingerprints, people's DNA patterns are in these databases, and that's what they were developed for. Because now if you find DNA or you find it at a crime scene, now you can plug it into those systems, and if you get a match, then you got a lead on who the person is that deposited that fingerprint or that DNA sample at your crime scene. If you go back, remember DNA wasn't discovered to the mid-50s, but DNA profiling wasn't until the early 1980s, and it didn't enter the courtrooms until the late 1980s. Again, all this is discussed in the books. But if you set your story in the 1970s, there's no DNA. There's fingerprints, but there's no DNA. So you can decide where you're setting your story, the time frame you're setting your story, as to how much of this you want to deal with. And you can see the further back you go, the easier it is to ignore the science because there was none. So then it becomes more interpersonal relations. Is that easier storytelling? Not necessarily. But at least there's less stuff you have to consider. There's less balls you have to keep in the air. There's less things that you have to put up with. Now, if you have a criminal breaking into someone's home and murdering them, well, they can't leave fingerprints. They can't leave behind their hair. They can't leave behind their blood or their semen or whatever. They can't touch anything. Their shoe prints can be picked up. And from that, so much can be gleaned about who this person is. And now let's look at where we're headed in the future to make this even more complex. What can DNA do now? Well, we've talked about nuclear DNA, which is what we use for DNA profiling to compare individual to individual. But there's also mitochondrial DNA. The mitochondrial DNA, again, this is explained in the books in great detail, but the point is that mitochondrial DNA is a DNA that's outside the nucleus. It's in these little things called mitochondria in the cells, and it comes from the mother's line. So all the way back up the line, your mother, your grandmother, your mother's siblings, so your aunts, your grandaunts, all this stuff up the female line, all have the same mitochondrial DNA. So if you find a certain blood sample and there's mitochondrial DNA that matches a woman that is suspect in the case, it could be her, but it could be her sisters. It could be her aunts. It could be her grandmother. All it does is tell you that, but it can be a useful tool, again, for exclusion. And then you take a step forward. Now we've looked at familial DNA. Now, first of all humans and all primates, so chimpanzees and the great apes and all that, we all share 98% of our DNA. It's the other 2% that's the change, which probably explains a lot of human behavior. But the point is that we all share a lot of DNA, so our DNA is pretty similar. But in families, in people who are closely related, it's even more similar. And it's complex, and I'm not going to go into it here, but it's more similar. So if you find a DNA profile, and then you find another one that's similar, you can say, well, they're closely related to each other. This is what happened in the famous Grim Sleeper case here in Southern California, where through one of the genetic databases, they found that the DNA of the suspect had left closely matched someone there, and it turned out to be the son of Lonnie Franklin, who was the Grim Sleeper. And the next thing you know, then they had to get Lonnie's DNA, and sure enough, that's how they caught him. But it was done through familial DNA by saying it's close. It's not that person, but it's close. And so it must be someone close to him genetically. And then there's Even now, what's coming online and is not there yet is phenotypic analysis. What does that mean? Your genotype is your genetic makeup. Your phenotype is what you look like. So in other words, your genetics determine if you're 6'4", if you have blue eyes, if you have blonde hair, if you're male or female, if you can play the piano. It determines a whole lot of things. So it does determine what you look like. Well, now let's say they find a DNA sample. They don't have a suspect. They don't know who to match it to. They've checked it in the database. There's nothing there. So they can take this DNA and from it analyze what this person likely looked like. How tall they were, what kind of body stature they had, what their race was, what their hair color was, what their eye color was, some facial features. This is becoming better and better and better. It's not there yet. There's some links again on the show notes that'll be posted here and on my website and my blog that shows you how this works. So if you're ultra modern and you're writing a story like now, that's something you can use. But if you write it in the past, you don't. But what's the biggest change? We've talked about a lot of biological and physical stuff here, but to me, the biggest change in how you construct a crime fiction story now versus then, say 50 years ago, is electronics. Your cell phones, your computers, your emails, your text, your voicemails, all this stuff. Facial recognition, video cameras, security cameras, the Visor system that can clean up, fuzzy video. All of these electronic things are pretty scary. They're extremely useful. So a criminal now not only has to not leave his fingerprints and his DNA behind and his tire tracks and shoe prints and all this stuff, he's got to be aware of security cameras. He's got to be aware of his cell phone. You can't go online and search for cyanide. The famous Stella Nickell case, and again, there's a link to that in the show notes. She's the one that put cyanide and Excedrin up in the Pacific Northwest to kill her husband and put it on shelves and killed a bunch of other people. Well, interesting, one of the pieces of evidence in that was that they went to the library and found there was a book that had been checked out by her, and her fingerprints were all over the pages on cyanide. And so it connected her to her research. Well, they don't have to do that anymore. I mean, that was a pretty lucky break, but it was an important break in that case. Now, your computer stores all that data, and I don't care if you try to erase your hard drive or try to empty your trash or try to, get rid of your browser history. Forensic computer experts can often go in there and find all this stuff you thought you deleted, because it's not really deleted. It's just unaddressed. In other words, it can't be found, but it's there. So, this whole world, how many times have you seen a case on TV where the person's cell phone has been tracked? No, I wasn't anywhere near there. I was 50 miles away. Really? How'd your cell phone get over there in her backyard? So same way, people think that when they send text and they leave voice messages and they do computer searches, that this is all somehow private. It's not. It's recorded. It's kept. It's there. They're going to know where you are. Well, one of the ways that criminals get around this nowadays is with burner phones. Remember, you set your story back in the 70s, there weren't cell phones. I know it's hard to believe a time like that. So maybe they go get a fingerprint off a payphone where the guy opened the door to the payphone booth. But nowadays, it's all cellular. One of the ways that the criminals get around this is with burner phones or these prepaid cell phones. And you can buy that phone and you can make your calls, and they may not know who made the call or who owns the phone. They can still trace the numbers that were called. They can trace it back to that phone. Most of them don't have GPS, so they can't trace the location directly, but they can with cell towers and things like this. So in other words, they can track the phone. But who owns the phone? Who's making the calls? That's the hard part. Now, you pick up your phone, you make a call, and, you do something dastardly. Well, they're going to trace it back to you and say, well, Joe owns this phone. Joe's got some explaining to do, and either he did it or somebody did it around him, or his phone was stolen or he lost it or whatever, and Joe better have an explanation. With the burner phones, that's all out. So what do you do now? Again, electronics. A lot of people who use these phones, they go in and pay cash somewhere. So there's no trace to them. But again, video cameras. Maybe the store has security. Maybe the bank across the street. Maybe the tire store next door does. Somewhere around the neighborhood, there may be cameras that can then pick up this individual, maybe even pick up the car that he drove and the license plate number, and now you're in trouble. So there's a lot to consider here. There's a lot of things going on in the forensic science world and in the police investigative world, criminal investigation world, that are changing rapidly and moving forward. So how you can avoid these best by setting your story in the past or by being very clever now. So back to the original question. Does all of this make crime fiction harder or easier to write now? I think it's both. I think it doesn't make it easier, let's put it that way, rather than harder, because at the end of the day, it's still about people interaction, and stories aren't about the crime. They're about the effect of the crime. They're about the people who are investigating the crime, who are victims of the crime, who are the collateral damage from the crime. Those are what the best stories are about. They're about people. I think Michael Connelly famously said, it's not the effect of the cop on the crime, it's the effect of the crime on the cop. And I think that is true of everybody in the story. It's the effect of the crime. It's the effect of the murder or the trauma or whatever on the individual. And that's good storytelling. And if you look at that and you focus on that, it really does not make any difference whether if your story's set in 1800 or 2018. It makes no difference, because it still comes back to people interactions and asking questions and etc. And the savvy and the experience and the nerve and the intelligence of your investigator, whoever that might be, professional or otherwise. On the other hand, it is harder because you have to know more. You cannot ignore forensic science. You cannot ignore all these investigative techniques because they're there. And if you set your story in modern times, even setting them in a small town, out in a rural area can help some, but you still have to be aware that fingerprints and DNA and hair and fiber and footprints and tire tracks and all of these things are in play. And you have to at least think about them in your story. So yes, there are more balls to keep in the air, and yes, you have to be more versed in criminal investigation and forensic science. So the answer to the question is yes and no. Yes, it's harder, and no, it's not really harder. And that's all up to you. How do you feel about it? How do you feel about your stories? And there will be, like I said, show notes that will have links to a lot of cases and a lot of things that will help you, understand more about forensic science and police investigation, and that's a good thing. But at the end of the day, what I want to leave you with is that, remember, your story is about character. The crime is just the milieu and the driving force and the complication of this human story. Don't ever forget that. It's about people, and it's about your good guy trying to track down the bad guy and all the people who help and interfere and all the red herrings and all the head fakes and all the stuff that goes along the way. But at the end of the day, the reader wants to be invested in your protagonist. They want to like that person. They want to believe that person. They want to follow that person, and they want that person to win. So focus on the person and not necessarily the science. So that ends this broadcast. And until next time, this is DP Lyle, and this is Criminal Mischief. And I hope you've had fun with this and maybe learned a couple of things. See you later.